Hello, I'm Charles Malet with the UK column Interview. Today I have with me Jeremy Nell, or you may know him as Jerm, a cartoonist and podcaster par excellence, and a man who is accustomed to asking the questions. But today the boot will be on the other foot, and he's going to need to come up with the answers. Jerm, thank you very much for joining me, and a very, very warm welcome to UK column.
Charles, thanks for having me. I just want to say, I I actually forgot how to pronounce your surname. I'm so glad you said Mallet because I was going to say Malay and make you sound very fancy.
If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it depends which side of the English Channel you're on. If you're on the right-hand side, then you'd have been completely correct. So I don't think that's not going to count against you. But actually, you bring me neatly, as though we've rehearsed it, into the first question, which is to do with division. Because what I'd like to do is go back some time, and I'd like your perspective because this is an international audience that's going to be listening to this, but the UK column audience is largely British. You're South African. In your perspective, as somebody growing up in post-apartheid South Africa, how did the country deal with that process of reinventing itself after apartheid?
Just technically, I also grew up in apartheid, not just post-apartheid, but during the height of it, which was in the 80s. It's an interesting question. It's a very, very layered question because I don't think South Africa has come out of it with any great degree of success. There's the term like rainbow nation, which I think Nelson Mandela coined. It really doesn't mean anything. It's just marketing hype. The country in many ways is better than what it was, but it's also worse than what it was. It just depends on who you're asking. If you look at the data, one of the big claims is that it benefited white people. And the irony is that economically and financially, you can clearly see that it didn't because the incomes were not only peaking, but uh, they were decreasing. Because obviously, if you have a system that's isolated from the world, you will run out of resources. You need to integrate with the world in order to grow. And once apartheid was ended and sort of quote unquote democracy began in South Africa, uh, you can see that salaries all over the place increased, including white people. So you could even argue that post apartheid was better for white South Africans than apartheid. But crime is also exceptionally high as a result post apartheid, and you kind of wonder why. Is that domestic or is it a foreign backed? I don't know, but crime is unbelievably out of control in South Africa. And if you live here, you have to be quite streetwise. Now, I'm not saying that it's a war zone. If it were, I would have emigrated. I love South Africa. It is my home, but I also want to point out that social media is not a mirror image of reality. It's sort of it's an amplification of an extreme minority view. If you only followed X, you would think that this is a complete war zone and it's just it's cowboys and Indians gun shootouts every single day. No, that's not the case at all. I think race relations are by far better than what the media will have you believe. And I think it's only on the fringe. It's in certain areas. It's in pockets. And certainly, there's a lot of political influence in that. Because I think if you leave people alone, they tend to get on fine. And I think that is maybe not just endemic to South Africa, but probably everywhere. If you just leave people alone, they tend to they tend to be fine. People get on. People don't want to fight with one another, which is why I think a lot of the stuff is externally triggered. So I'm I'm still happy living in South Africa despite all the warts, and I really do appreciate the fact that we can trade with the rest of the world and travel. I mean, it was very difficult in the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you bring me on to what I wanted to talk about from exactly that reality, but specifically to do with not being, I suppose, for want of a better word, interfered with. And you cite well, I think you described South Africa as being a broken country in some
Yeah.
respects, and therefore the resilience that builds. Will you just explain a bit more? What do you mean by that, and how do you see that taking effect, sort of either in a good way or a bad way?
Yeah, so I've often said that I prefer South Africa as a failed state, and South Africa is a failed state, I think, by any metric. In fact, I think every African state is effectively a failed state, uh, and I like that because what it means, COVID was a great example of this, is that it showed that an inept, ineffective, useless government wasn't nearly good enough to impose, hardcore vaccine mandates. I think South Africa was probably one of the lowest vaccine uptakes in the world, and Africa as a whole generally had a very, very low vaccine uptake during the COVID era. Whereas I've got, expat friends who live in Canada and Australia and even the UK, and they all said the same thing to me. It sucks being, in a country with a highly effective government, because they become very, efficient at things like mandates and locking you down. So there's a strange, ironic sense of freedom within chaos, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I mean. And I guess a byproduct of that, Charles, is that it forces you to become self-reliant. It forces you not to trust the state, because the state isn't really going to be there for you. You kind of have to make things happen for yourself, and it forces you into a state of, or into a sense of community driven collaboration. You have to figure things out because when you got potholes in the roads, and you got street lights that don't work, you have to then go and fill those potholes because the government is not going to do that anytime soon, and you have to figure out how to make the streets look better. And so generally, I think there is a sense of independence, therefore, that comes with a failed state.
Yeah, and I think that certainly for the UK audience, I think that's something that people really need to bear in mind, that sort of distinction between a failed state and perhaps a failing state. Here
Mm,
we're very much in the pothole zone, but not having gone as far as people doing something about it. That there is still, I think, an enormous reliance upon the state in whatever sort of form it takes. But so on that, that greater picture with resilience, I think people are very quick to bemoan how pathetic younger generations are and how they don't, they aren't growing up to learn the lessons of the past and this that, and the other. What's your take on that in not just South Africa, but sort of Southern Africa or Africa, I mean, other parts of the world? How do you see that?
Something I have noticed is that there's a strong victimhood mentality that exists, particularly in Western countries where they have everything. You sit back and you moan. You become a keyboard warrior. Look, this is broken. Somebody must do something about it, while I enjoy my McDonald's. And this it's okay. I mean, that is the way it is. But I think because there's this yo-yo effect of how societies work, excuse me, that decline will at some point occur, and then you wonder how will those people handle that decline. I sometimes joke and I say where Europe is now is where perhaps South Africa was, 2 decades ago, and lessons that Europeans could learn, simply by looking at our history. Um, and perhaps even the states. I don't know. I don't exactly know the dynamics in the US, but what what I do feel is that I don't know also if it applies to Eastern countries. This is outside of my understanding, but I can certainly speak to some degree in the West. And I also want to add a disclaimer. I don't know if South Africa or African countries fall under the Western label. I suppose it depends on what sort of criteria you want to use. Maybe I can say I am Western. Maybe I can say I'm not Western. I don't know. But one thing is for certain, is that I see a lot of lazy people coming out now. The sort of post 2000 generation, huge amounts of sort of this TikTok, Facebook Reels mindset, where you just kind of your hand motion becomes part of your lifestyle. You just scroll, 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 and you end up doing nothing. And so there's a strange yo-yo effect in which people once were very much driven to solving their own problems are now relying on other people to solve their problems, outsourcing their thinking, outsourcing who they are, outsourcing their identity even. And I find that happening here also, certainly in the middle to upper classes. I don't know, Charles, if that is a geopolitical thing or cultural, or if it's just the nature of wealth. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, certainly all pervasive, and I think
Mm,
that's the issue. I suppose it's just interesting to see how abruptly what you describe of the South Africa that you grew up in can be
yeah,
swept away by a movement like that. And I think I would say from a British perspective, there's that hope that you want to look at another country and see that it is different and it is responding differently to those pressures. Because of course the other thing, in a way, in that with the either smaller or failed idea of the state, what that does create for so many African countries is masses of space for the so-called philanthropists or NGOs or whoever, and they are able to wreak havoc, for want of a better term. I mean, is that something you see, and how's that sort of in South Africa now?
yeah. It's not so much, I think, a consequence of a failed state, but a consequence of democracy. So wherever you have a democratic state, in my view, you have an open gate to infiltration of the state itself, because you have financial interests, you have corporate interests, you have technocratic, public-private partnership interests. You know, if you look at South Africa's sort of economic heart, you'll see that our mines, which is part of that heart, are very much not South African. I mean, I think our biggest mine is called Anglo American, and we can go down various rabbit holes to see who's behind, or at the top of those mines. But what's interesting is that's not unique to South Africa. That's unique to wherever there's a democratic state. So I'm very, very critical of democracy as a whole. But I mean, I don't think I'm special in that way. Plato wrote about the problems with the democratic idea long time ago. So I think by virtue of a country being democratic, it opens itself up to the infiltration and interests of those who don't really care about sovereignty, because at the end of the day, the president of a democracy is just rent seeking for at least 4 or 5 years, and so his entire existence is based around those 4 or 5 years and hoping that he can get another 4 or 5 years through excellent marketing.
Yeah, very well put. And of course, the other point about democracy really is that it should be a system that is accountable. And certainly for you, part of holding a democracy or indeed a system to account has been via your cartoons,
Yeah.
which obviously you've been doing for a long, long time. Talk about your how you broke into that space and what pushed you to do that in the first place.
Firstly, your opening there was great. I think democracies also do have a good side, and they allow for, or they should, they should allow for the critique or the criticism of authority. I mean, you can't do that in China. Now, I like China for many reasons, but one of the reasons that I don't like China is that you can't really criticize the government. So here you got to choose your battle. So I would do terribly as a cartoonist in China. Thankfully, I can do pretty well in South Africa because we have such a useless government that they can't even sue me, because it just doesn't really work all that well, in this kind of setup. So I can criticize the government quite easily and quite freely. In actual fact, I've got a lot more freedom in my work here than I do in many countries. I would even go as far as saying, Charles, that I've probably got more freedom in my work than in your country. Based on what I understand, I could be wrong, but um, how I got into it was really very boring. It was just a case of I've always loved cartoons from a kid. I used to draw in my Bible in Sunday school, and I remember just wanting to just draw cartoons. And when I was retrenched from my corporate job in 2005, I was working in sort of mobile research and technology, and at that stage, smartphones hadn't really come out yet, so it was still the old sort of Nokias with buttons on them. Uh, when I was retrenched, because the whole industry was changing, I figured, well, maybe I could make a career out of this. I am a failed art student, so I had something behind me, but perhaps it was pretty punk rock, to go into art when you fail art. And I was advised never to go into art. So I thought, well, this is quite rebellious. Maybe I can make this work. And yeah, and I did. And a bunch of editors sort of bit, and I started having my work published. And I wasn't really making political comments or any type of sort of uh, current affair based commentary at that stage until a couple of years later when I was contacted by a major newspaper, and they wanted me to draw daily for them, and they said, look, we like your style. Would you like to comment on the politics of the day? And I said, look, I don't really even know where I stand or what I believe in or anything like that. And they said, and my editor at the time made a really great comment, which I've never forgotten. And he said, look, knock them down when they're up and help them up when they're down. And that kind of formed the foundation for what was going to be my political career. And after that, I won awards and published books. And eventually, in the sort of 2010s, I started formulating my ideological outlook. However, I don't speak only for myself here, but I think my ideological outlook completely changed around 2020, like I think many others around the world, when you suddenly realize, wait a minute, something's not right here. So that's the sort of the backdrop of my cartooning story. And I mean, I've published, I think, close to 10,000 cartoons since then, and they've been translated and been to different publications around the world and all that. So it just became a love that I just pursued.
Perhaps hard to say with any certainty of hitting objectivity in hindsight, but as that period of time developed before we got to 2020, were you aware that you were developing insofar as how you were thinking about things before you were translating them into cartoon format?
Yes, I would have classified myself, I think, for the longest time as libertarian or sort of uh, kind of conservative-ish. But I've come to realize that those terms don't mean anything anymore, Charles. A lot of this stuff, these are just false dichotomies, or as I forget who it is now. Somebody said a few years ago, false binaries. But basically, these are. I mean, we started off the conversation about division, and I think these are interesting um, divisions, left, right. I don't think the people to the left and right of me are my enemies. I think those who are trying to take away my sovereignty and my ability to live a free life, I think those are my enemies. Not people who are arguing about gender, because we can still chat about that, and they're not removing anything from me. Um, so I I think at that stage before 2020, I didn't really consider the sort of interwovenness of the international web of what's the word I'm looking for, Charles? This sort of deep, dark connectivity of the oligarchical hierarchy, shall I say, of how things. For example, I would have thought in, let's say, 2016, just pick a year, I would have thought that the Kruger National Park, which is our biggest game park and one of the biggest game parks in the world, and I might add probably one of the happiest places in the world. I thought that was just run by the government, and it had people doing their best to keep it operational. Post 2020, I come to realize through research that it's not really run by the South African government. It has UN fingers in it, and it has, CITES, for example, and it has so many other interests that don't really care about animals or South Africa, but rather, I don't know, land, possible land opportunities and other things. It's never as simple as, oh, it's just a park that's run by the government. It's more complicated than that, and that's the nature of everything. Everything is more nuanced and more complicated, and that's kind of where I found myself heading after 2020.
Yeah, you certainly have, and we'll get to that in a second. But no, you're absolutely right, and I think you're scratching beneath the surface almost anywhere, and you will find
Mm,
something that perhaps you didn't expect or you didn't want
yeah.
necessarily to find. And you spoke a moment ago about South Africa feeling more free than the UK, perhaps in terms of publishing
Mm.
certain materials and whatnot. And I mean, I think I would absolutely agree with you. But on the censorship front, which is now such a hot topic, particularly in this sphere, was that something that you did battle with at all at that time, sort of prior to 2020? Was censorship really a consideration for you, or indeed for the media in South Africa?
Yes, I mean, for the longest time, I was working in the mainstream media, and the mainstream media itself self censors. And in many ways, self censorship is actually more destructive than a state sanctioned censorship. Uh, because what it does, I'm sure you'll agree, excuse me, is that it causes a collective sense of silence, of people not wanting to discuss anything. And nobody's actually forcing them to do that. They're just choosing not to speak about things. And so you start kicking the can down the road and you start sweeping things under the rug. And you really shouldn't have to. Um, so I found myself in a situation where I was self-censoring because there are a couple of things in South Africa that you just can't do. Um, and then the publications themselves would also get worried about certain things. And not even hot button issues, like, let's say, I don't know, unions. I found myself criticizing unions, and the certain newspapers would think this is a little bit, edgy. We're going to get too much pushback from the unions, so let's not run something like that. uh, or I found, for example, in 2020, before I mean, I think that was maybe the last year that I was working in the mainstream media as a cartoonist. um, I was drawing for one of the largest papers in the country, and I it was just before lockdowns. I think our lockdowns came in the same week as your lockdowns in the UK, and about 2 weeks prior to that, I drew our president pulling a mask over his eyes and saying something along the lines of "We are ready." Because at that stage, I kind of thought that this was a real thing. I kind of thought maybe there was a bit of overreaction, but it was a real thing. The paper decided not to publish it. They wanted to censor this because they thought it was an unfair criticism of the president, which is absurd. But not just that. 2 weeks later on live TV, he did exactly that. He pulled the mask over his eyes accidentally, and he fumbled, and it became a big joke and a big meme. So the joke was that in many ways that I the what's that saying, where reality becomes, or humor becomes reality, or something to that effect. But I had predicted accidentally what was going to happen, and it should have been published. It shouldn't have been self-censored. And it wasn't long after that when I was fired, because the publication felt that this was a serious thing, and we shouldn't joke about it. Um, and that's not even state-sanctioned censorship. So now we see this weird domino effect of fear perpetuating fear, which is, I think, very destructive.
Hugely so, and the self-censorship, you're absolutely right, and I think it applies to more than just censorship. Because going back to lockdowns, I mean, certainly what we saw
Mm,
here was the insinuation that something ghastly was about to happen, and that the government were really desperately trying to hold back. And then the next thing you knew was that organisations, and the one that springs to mind here was the church, was shutting the door before it had even been asked to.
yes.
And so yes, you're completely right, and it's a very dangerous area on the self censorship. But this brings me into what germ warfare really is all about, which is, as you quite rightly describe it, the information war.
Mm.
Now, I think my feeling is that it absolutely is an information war, but in large part the people that are, I suppose, caught up in it, the blob, don't appreciate that it's an information war, because they have no idea of the manipulation of the information that they are receiving. Now, going back to that time in 2020, and looking towards where you have gone with germ warfare, what was it that did push you towards the direction you've gone in, and realizing to what extent there was this information war?
I think the whole thing with the lockdowns, I think that was for many people, um, just a trigger. Like, for example, let's just start at the most basic. I said a moment ago that our lockdown started in the same week as your lockdowns. How? How does that even happen? Is it just coincidence, which the average quote unquote normie would think, oh, that's it's just the government's caring about their people? Well, most of the world did this very coincidentally. Then in that case, I mean, it's one hell of a coincidence that the presidents are just announcing lockdowns all over the place using the same language. Social distancing, a term that I'd never in my life heard before 2020. It turns out that it was used in a movie. It came out, I think, in 2011 or 2012. I think it's called Contagion, which I had never heard of. And then I watched it during lockdown and it freaked me out because it was exactly the same thing. It was a coronavirus outbreak. People had to get locked in their homes, and the solution was a vaccine. I think it was in the movie. It's freaky. And I remember thinking, okay, all right, yeah, virus from a wet market. My understanding at that stage was extremely primitive. I thought, it's those disgusting Chinese again, with their blood everywhere and their filth and viruses and bacteria and everything just jumping onto people. I mean, that's kind of what I thought because I just had no knowledge of what of reality. And then very quickly I started thinking about this, like what Northern Italy, there's this weird outbreak, and then suddenly Trump's announcing closure of flights with China, and I'm at that stage I didn't realize that perhaps there's an anti-China narrative that's coming from somewhere, and suddenly everybody's getting locked down at the same time. And then within a few months, I found myself questioning the very nature of reality. Like, how does this even happen? How does the whole world do this at the same time? There has to be some sort of top-down collaboration, and then when you start looking into it, you go, okay, I see here. So the WHO did it, and then you start joining lots and lots of dots, and then of course when you speak about it, you're not quite sure what's going on yet, and people are like, it's just a conspiracy theory. You're just a nutcase. Okay, but explain the most basic things here. How? And nobody's able to give an answer. And so then I find myself just digging more and more and more. And then in my podcast, which I started in 2019, just by the way, as an extension to my cartoon work, it's just an expansion of ideas, which is what cartoons are. They're just ideas that are on paper. And so I decided to put this into podcast form. And then a guest might mention something that doesn't seem in any way connected to the coronavirus, and then suddenly that leads to another train of thought that makes sense. And then before you know it, Charles, I'm sitting, discussing concepts like who controls Europe, and it all started with lockdown. And then I suddenly realized, okay, so there must be some truth to this. I'm sure there's a lot of nonsense here also. And so like a sieve, I've got to filter through what's true and what's not true. But the point is, the shadow that gets cast over this is that nothing is really what it seems, whether by design or emergence or a combination. But there's a lot of fabrication of what you think is real, and you suddenly realize that the Matrix was not a movie, but it was a documentary. You know what I mean?
I do. I think a lot of the audience will absolutely understand exactly what you mean. And so going back, because that's such an interesting transition period to go from having started a podcast in 2019 and then to take that forward and realize that your view was what it was from 2020. But those around you that were contacts either within or through the mainstream media, did you find anybody there that was similarly questioning things, or was it similar to the UK where there was just there's one way with this and that's that?
Very few, Charles. Very, very few. Nobody wants to be labeled. You see, this is the problem. People are very scared of being ostracized. So I'm trying to think where I got the concept of the cathedral. I think it was Mencius Mollberg. What's his real name? I forget now. A great sort of philosophical thinker, but he goes by the name of Mencius Mollberg online, and he wrote a lot about something called dark enlightenment and whatever else, all these interesting philosophies. But he made a very good analogy. He compared what we're talking about now to the cathedral, calls it the cathedral. And if you go against the doctrine of the cathedral, you become an apostate, you get kicked out. And what makes the cathedral? Well, probably a combination of government, media, and academia. And that is not necessarily a collaboration of the three. They could all be working independently, but kind of they feed off one another just by virtue of their position in the establishment, in the established space, in conventional space. So, like the media will reference academia when it's talking about contagion or something like that, and the government will amplify that by making announcements, etc. And so they kind of all feed on one another constantly. And if you question that, you get kicked out, you get shunned, you get called a conspiracy theorist, and people are very scared of that. People don't want to be kicked out. They don't know what to do once they're outside the doors. Where do I go from here? Now my people are inside there and I'm out here and I'm alone. And so it's very difficult, very, very difficult to challenge an authoritative view on something. This came from a wet market. That was the view in 2020. This was a wet market. Then towards the end of 2020, people started going, but hold on, maybe it's a lab leak, which I think is also part of a psychological operation to some degree. But nonetheless, anybody in 2020 saying, oh, maybe this was leaked from a laboratory. No, that's just bonkers. That's bonkers. But now it's official US government policy. It's no longer bonkers. And now suddenly you have hordes of what I call personality cultists, because not everybody who supports Trump is a personality cultist, but there is a strong personality cult that's attached to Trump. It's an amazing thing to watch. They'll support, he can say anything, and then suddenly they'll change their position that they previously had and now agree with him. And so, it's kicking the can down the road again. Now suddenly the lab leak is a real thing. But the point I'm making is that if you mentioned it in the middle of 2020, you were considered a conspiracy theorist, and so what I find is that so few people want to go outside of that Overton window. They don't want to go anywhere near what would be considered unacceptable speech. We need to be within the boundaries of acceptable speech. I think it was Noam Chomsky who said that a wonderful way to control the narrative is by knowing where the boundaries of the narrative are and encouraging fierce debate within those parameters, so that even people inside those parameters look like they're arguing for what's true, but meanwhile the truth is sitting outside of those those parameters. And I think that's a classic example of what's been happening over the last few years. People are scared to be outside of that Overton window. They don't want to be outside the doors of the cathedral. And so therefore, you'll always find yourself as a minority view if you going against that sort of conventional or established thought.
Yeah, indeed. And on that, going outside of established thought, you've just referred to psychological operations, and you've spoken to an inordinate number of people now via your podcast of all sort of colours and creeds and philosophical beliefs. What to you is at the heart of a successful psychological operation? I mean, how is it done, and to what effect, I suppose?
I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that one out. I don't know, Charles, how it's possible that people around me, and I guess you'll say the same thing, I'm sure, but how is it possible that so few people around me can see through some of the stuff? How is it that the majority don't? How is it that we could climb on an airplane, let's have 180 people or something, and everybody's wearing a mask, unquestioning, they're just wearing it. Oh, okay, yeah, I'll wear a mask, and they don't question it. They just think this is what you must do. And the handful of people that do go, this doesn't make any sense. Even if it was a real virus, okay, let's just assume that even if there is a real virus traveling around in the air, a cloth mask does nothing, and any sane person knows this. You can just open a a book from when you were at school, a biology book, to see this the scale of what these things are claimed to be. But everybody just like sheep, cattle lining up for the slaughter. They just happily stand in a line and just go through that. And it's something that has been something I've been trying to figure out. And that's why I've spoken to people like Matthias Desmet and others, Peter Bregan also, to try and figure out how is it that people just don't question things in the main. Why is it always, as Matthias Desmet said, around 30% of people will question and try and see beyond? And will it ever go beyond 30%? It doesn't really seem likely, because if you notice now, people seem to be falling back into those sort of dreamlike states again. Um, uh, when it comes to various issues, suddenly the people that you thought were quote unquote awake are now falling asleep again. And how does this happen? This is something I don't know. It's for me, it's fascinating. And I certainly appreciate the input from people like Matthias and people like Peter Bregan, who they talk about free floating anxiety and the need then to be led, and perhaps that's what Yuri Bezmenov was referring to back in his great interview. I think it was ironically 1984. I think it was with it was a G. Edward Griffin, I think, when he said that when you have people in a state of anxiety or nervousness or uncertainty, they're malleable. You can control them with a lot more ease, rather than people who are, like for example, the LGBTQ agenda is about creating confusion within identity. When you don't know who you are, you can become controlled quite easily, because you no longer have control over yourself, because you don't know who or what you are. And I think that can be expanded and amplified into sort of a collective also, and maybe that plays into the idea that you just have masses of sheep. I don't want to say mass psychosis, by the way, because Matthias was very clear that it's not a psychosis necessarily. It's more like a hypnosis. And people like David Icke, for what it's worth, have also said much the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to go back and be certain about anything that's written historically. But of course, there is very little to suggest that those percentages that you refer to have ever been any different, and that human nature is just such that we are structured as society to be predisposed to either behave like this or like that. Now, yes, I mean, you identify something very pertinent with the suggestion that people are, for want of a better phrase, sort of falling back to sleep. How does that fit in with your categorization of the various coloured pills? You articulate, I think, very well the red, black, and white pilled sort of elements of the population. How do you see that fitting in with the falling back to sleep thing?
Okay, so just for clarity, what those pills mean, they obviously come from the Matrix. The blue pill is um, the world is as you think it is, right? You wake up and what you see is what you get. And of course, when you take the red pill, as the metaphor goes, you open the curtain, you pull back the curtain, and you see what's really going on behind the scenes. But the problem with that, and this is what sort of internet culture has kind of expanded on, because the movie didn't really do this. But if you get too red pilled, so to speak, it can become quite depressing, because you start seeing a lot of nefarious activity and sort of cynical behavior, and it's very dark, and you can get caught up in depression and nihilism, and that can lead you to what would be known as the black pill, where it's kind of defeatist, and you don't really see a point to anything. Let me just pour a glass of wine and enjoy the decline. But I think that's being a loser. I think that is a terrible, terrible way to approach life. I don't want to be around people like that. It's just too depressing. And so the white pill is basically then the follow on from the black pill, when you realize, well, hold on a second, I've got all this information. I feel more enlightened now. What can I do with it? And it's about overcoming. Um, and that then leads you to things like, well, let me wake up with a purpose. What am I going to do today? Am I going to be defeated? Am I going to be beaten today? No, I'm going to, I don't know. Let's start off with most basic things. I'm going to eat. I'm going to eat better so that I don't become fat and diabetic and and get cancer. Let me take control of my health. Let me go to the gym or get fit or go for a run. Let me go outside in the sun. Let me go back into nature. All these kind of things. These are white pill. These are ways to win. It's about not being defeated. And I think everybody can very easily and probably should go through a black pill phase, but get out of it as quick as possible. Because I was on antidepressants in 2020. I was taking all sorts of pharmaceuticals, and I realized that this is no good. This is no good. And I kind of woke up and made the choice to take control of my life, of my personal being. You live once, make it meaningful, and so that led me to seeing so much good again within that darkness. That you see when you pull back the curtain and you see reality for what it is. And then suddenly you can take a more, I don't know, you can take a more Marcus Aurelius approach and go, well, I'm not going to let that actually break me. I'm going to try and take those obstacles and turn them into features. I'm going to overcome them, and I'm going to succeed. And I think that is at the heart. It plays into the idea again of self-reliance and independence, and you can kind of maybe see how that horseshoes into the whole um, celebration, quote unquote, to some degree of a failed state. Because in many ways, I don't want to live in a failed state either. By the way, it would be nice to have things working. It would be nice to have trains that are safe and that can get from point A to point B. And buses and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a reason to welcome adversity, and I think that's part of that white pill mindset. So, for example, people around me who did perhaps wake up during the COVID era, many have stayed awake, and that's wonderful. But those who seem to be falling asleep again, I can decide how badly I want to be around them. I can either cherish their friendship if it's worth it, or spend less time with them so that I don't get that sort of negative influence, or I can continue trying to win them over, which is part of the battle of ideas. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very, very, very sort of philosophical answer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not putting it out there suggesting there is an answer to it, but
Mm,
I think it's completely fascinating, and everyone will have their own feelings on what you've
mm,
just said, and I think it's very powerful. But just on the specifics of it, I mean, you've alluded to the fact you were using pharmaceutical products that you're not using anymore.
mm.
What have been the big things for you that have actually really affected change in your life over that period that you really do sort of point to as being the big ones?
I guess another way of asking that question is what sort of big red pills have you swallowed, and been white pulled on? I think for me, Charles, just very, very anecdotally speaking, health has been a big one. Um, so having taken antidepressants, which are addictive and are a terrible thing, and nobody should stay on those things for any length of time, and things like proton pump inhibitors and all that kind of stuff, right? I was taking all of that stuff prescription, and it's very difficult to get off that stuff. But once you realize that you actually can control your health through your environment, through your diet, better sleeping, try not to get too stressed out. It's an ongoing journey. There's no overnight fix. This is a personal thing. This is a journey that each person decides to take upon themselves. But you know, weaning myself off antidepressants and other pharmaceuticals was not easy. But I was replacing a lot of that with routines. Things like atomic habits that James Clear writes about, and forming healthy habits, and also on a personal level, um, finding myself really loving my wife. Waking up in the morning and looking at her and going, you know what? I'm so blessed to wake up next to this beautiful woman. And when you're taking pharmaceuticals and you wired and you're so caught up in the big thing that's going on the whole time, you lose track of what's important and what matters. And I just went straight back to those fundamentals, the things that just make everything worth living. And then the words of I think it's Stephen Covey. I think that's his Covey. Is that his name? The guy who wrote the 7 Habits. Profound book. It's a self-help book, and most of it's junk. It's in the self-help category. But something that I've never forgotten that he said in that book is, you can't win the big battles. You can fight them, but you can't win them. You can't change your government. You, Charles, you can't go and change your government. You can't influence change other than your immediate environment, right? You can only change what's immediate to you. You can fight the bigger battles, and that's what we are doing. You and I, we're chatting, and this goes out, and people think about it, and they get involved in things and all that. But that's outside of your control, and it's that paradigm shift that occurred to me during the COVID era, that I realized I can't change the lockdowns. They're going to happen whether or not I'm getting angry and upset about them, and I end up losing. I'm the one who gets no sleep at night, and I'm freaking out, and this is nobody high up cares. I'm just a number, but I care. And so that was when I realized I got to focus inwards again and influence change on that which is close to me. And that for me is what became pretty powerful, if that makes sense. And then you can, then by extension, you can fight the bigger battles and realize that those are long-term games.
Very powerful and very candid answer. Thank you very much for that. And that will give people a lot to think about on the personal level. And exactly like you articulate, controlling the things that are within your gift to control, and therefore to make yourself happy as a result of it. That said, you have, of course, spoken to a huge number of people who are doing all sorts of interesting and different things. Are you seeing areas within which there is, for want of a better word, success in terms of pushback or rejection of the new world order, or whatever one might want to describe? You seeing that sort of thing occurring? So, these sorts of successes.
I think so. I think again it plays into that 30% number that Matthias spoke about. I think that maybe a third, certainly not half, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. I think there is a small number of people in my circles that are certainly thinking differently to what they did a few years ago, and are certainly behaving and acting differently. I know for a fact, for example, and I think this is a big win, a number of people in my circles no longer believe in vaccines, not just COVID, but any vaccines. I don't believe in any vaccines anymore. If you had asked me about vaccines in 2019, yes, sure. Yeah, vaccines work. Yeah, absolutely. Now I do not trust any pharmaceutical claim about any vaccine, knowing what I know now. And if you just think about it without even going into the science, how did humanity survive for so long without the magic of vaccines? Well, diet, lifestyle, all the environmental factors that get lost in these scientific discussions. People get so caught up in their lane, shall I say, that they just don't have the ability to zoom out and just look at the big picture and realize you don't actually need a vaccine in order to be healthy. The idea that you have to have an injection that goes into your muscle in your arm to keep you healthy for 20 years, it seems just utterly absurd. And I mean, I think that's a big one, because that's an actual drug. It's a toxin that's being injected into your body. I mean, we're not just having a conversation. There's an actual thing that's going on here. And I love that so many people around me now are looking at this more critically, and saying it, not just thinking it. It's still difficult, when somebody dies suddenly or dies from something strange. I don't know if you're the same, but I find myself thinking, I wonder if they had the shot. And with you have to read the room, because some people do not like that question at all. It's a no-go zone. But I'm happy to be around a number of people who are okay with that, and go, yeah, I think he got the shot. And then you can't prove that it was a shot, but you can kind of start making connections and going, well, okay, he was healthy and suddenly he just dropped dead on the sports field. Um, so I think to some degree there are multiple wins that are happening, at least in my circles, and I like that. That for me is very uplifting. So yes, I do see a change, and it's not just that; it's other things also. It's also geopolitical. Um, so it could be, it doesn't really matter, but it can be people changing their views on previously held views that they're now letting go of. So, but as I said, I think it still plays into that 30-40% number, and I don't know if it'll ever go above that, Charles.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right, but it's exactly like you articulate. It's a question of discerning who is going to be receptive to such and such an idea, or just at least thinking about something. And we've all experienced the effect that the red pill can have, which that it
Mm.
can invoke a tendency to behave like a bull in china shop and experience the backfire effect. Now you have a mastery for asking questions. How have you found to be the best technique for broaching these sorts of subjects with people, or is it on a sort of individual by individual basis? How do you decide?
I'm just interested. It's as simple as that. I'm just interested in learning. I just want to know. I want to know more, and I make the assumption that the person with whom I'm talking knows more. It's as simple as that. And you don't get anywhere if you are being, um, what's the word, um, abrasive, or just trying to, so you're interviewing somebody, but then you give your opinion all the time. That's not how you learn. I think it was Peter Boghossian who wrote, yes, it is. It's Peter who wrote the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And by the way, it's a book I highly recommend. Um, it's an orange book, so you can't miss it. And he wrote it with James Lindsay. He did those experiments, those social experiments with Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. They're very, very funny, where they showed how the peer review system's broken. And he basically suggests that you need to genuinely be interested. It's as simple as that. And through that, uh, allow yourself to learn. Don't assume that you know more. And that's the other thing. When you interview people, I'm sure you will agree, Charles. You realize how little you actually know about so many things. Um, you you learn more, but you also learn how much you don't know. And it's the most incredible experience. Let me give you an example. So I've done, I don't know, about 1,000 interviews, and I've had some of the best discussions with communists. Now, and I say that because they self-described communists, right? And the only reason why I'm saying that is because the whole Ukraine thing happened, and so I started focusing on that. And I realized that these terms really do not adequately signify who or what people believe. It's just a single word to define an entire person and their experience in life. And you realize that it's silly. Yeah, these words help for conversations, and of course for most dialogue. We need descriptors for general understanding of things. But when you come down to it and you sit with somebody like I did on many occasions, and I realized I agree with that point. I agree with that point. Oh wow, I agree with that point too. But I'm not a communist. What's going on here? And that's what made me realize how little I actually know, because even people who label themselves as things don't entirely fit into these things, because there's so much more than a label, if that makes sense. And that's why I've kind of dismissed the left-right sort of liberal conservative dichotomies for the most part. And I just look at myself and I go, well, what do I think about a situation? What is my position on that? What is my view? And does that person have a point? Yeah, I think so. Does he have a point? No, I don't know if I agree with that. And so I kind of kind of formulate my own position based on that. And I think any sane person, just by the way, on this, any sane person who's done a bit of history will know that the sort of left-right ideology narrative came out of the French Revolution. I mean, that was hundreds of years ago. I mean, it's no longer relevant. I mean, if you ask anybody today, what does it mean to be right-wing or far right is the media term, nobody knows. Nobody can define these terms. And until these terms can be adequately defined, you can't use them effectively. Otherwise, we're just throwing around pointless words. So I found myself having the most incredible conversations with people with whom I 10 years ago would have vehemently just outright disagreed without even giving them a chance. And I think that's the point. When you give people a chance to, and you listen, which is what Peter Boghossian said in his book, you just listen and you show an interest. There's a whole wealth of knowledge that you end up gaining.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, without a doubt. And for anybody that isn't familiar with your podcast, and indeed slightly depends on the time or date, I should say, that anyone listens to this interview, because the situation is somewhat changing. But just describe the Jerm Warfare podcast in a nutshell, but with a view to the future.
Well, effectively, it's the battle of ideas. So it is in engaging in topics or talking points that are traditionally perhaps taboo or unconventional or fringe or conspiratorial or whatever, generally speaking, that might challenge mainstream thinking. So it's effectively approaching what you might consider even dangerous ideas for the purposes of learning, and also fitting together the puzzle. It's slowly piecing together the puzzle of how things work. You spoke about the New World Order, Agenda 2030. These are all real things. Sustainable development is a real thing. It is a United Nations ambition for centralized control of countries. This is not airy fairy stuff. It's a real thing. It's documented. They want, they want people to move into cities and open up land and give the land to the state so that they can build solar panels and all sorts of other stuff. And these sort of mega ultra cities that Klaus Schwab, for example, has spoken about. This is all real stuff, and yet in the mainstream, there's this weird type of closed mindedness that still doesn't want to acknowledge that there is a bigger set of realities that are going on around us. If I open a newspaper today, it'll just talk about how the government has done X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't go further than that. Here in South Africa, we've got an issue with farm murders, right? And it's a real thing. And we have a scary amount of particularly white farmers who get attacked on a weekly basis, either attacked, killed, but it's not good. But if you were to speak about this with your average South African who doesn't think terribly far, they would just think that it's just black people who hate white people. But it's not that, in my view. I think that it's deeper than that. I think that this is part of a global attempt with foreign interests to keep at least South Africa destabilized. Because when you have a destabilized agricultural setup like we do, you can then infiltrate with a lot more ease. You can get into government policy making. You can get into corporate policy making. And it's, again, as I said earlier, when people are in a state of fear and anxiety, you can control them with a lot more ease. Agriculture, I think, is not just an issue in South Africa. I think the Netherlands is also facing all types of agricultural attacks. So a myopic view where it's just racism. It's maybe some of that, yes, sure, but I think it's bigger than that. And this is what happens when you sit within that sort of mainstream mindset. You don't want to look bigger. You don't realize that there are a lot of links that go outside of your view. The world is interconnected, and there is a big web, and there are a lot of things that are connected to a lot of other things, and so that's what Jerm Warfare is about. It's about trying to just find those links and connect them, and a lot of them might not work, but that's part of the process. It's part of the journey.
Excellent. A very good summary. And for those who are aware of Jerm Warfare, then a handy reminder. To those that aren't, they have something to look forward to. The eagle-eyed amongst the audience would have noticed
Mm.
already that there are one or two cartoons of germs that are tagged UK column. And by now, well, depending on the date of the release of the interview, but UK Column is now to be host to Germ Warfare in some guise or other. So that's something we look forward to enormously. Just give us your thoughts on the collaboration with UK Column.
I have been wanting to collaborate with UK Column for a very long time, Charles. I said this to you previously. I interviewed Brian, I think back in 2021 already. Big fan of the work that UK Column does. I think it's a very important voice, and it's not just UK based. The fact that I'm in South Africa and have been following it for years is an indication that it is global, and it's an important global voice, and it's a very, what is the opposite of sensational? I don't want to say moderate. That's the wrong word, but it's a well thought out take on what's going on. I'm trying to compare it to Infowars, which is highly sensational. It's not that. It's a lot more. Um, it's more reasoned. There we go. It's more reasoned. And I love that. And I'm looking forward to doing a type of broadcast with UK Column, and of course, I'm enjoying drawing for UK Column. It is a wonderful collaboration that I find extremely fulfilling personally, and of course, I think valuable externally. I think a lot of people will appreciate our collaboration. And I just quickly want to say, we keep saying germ warfare, which is correct, but some people get confused. It's not germ with a G. We're not talking about bacteria or viruses. My name is Jeremy, and it's just a play on words. So it's germ with a J. So it's just literally wordplay. That's all it is. And so it's all about the battle and the war and and it's all those sort of metaphors kind of come into one. So just so that people spell it correctly, because I'll always get incorrect spelling.
I will make sure I type that up with the right keys for the notes for this interview. Indeed. Now, obviously, this is very exciting for UK Column as well. It will be in effect under your own brand. So now, just tell people where they can go to find out more about what you have been doing, what you do, and any social media and that sort of thing.
Well, obviously, jermwarfare.com, my website, is the home. I mean, there's no point in me mentioning all the other stuff because it's all on the website, social media, etc. Jermwarfare.com with a J. But I suspect that the stuff that I'm going to be doing with UK Column will also be on UK Column's website, Charles. So I think it'll be those two websites.
Perfect. I mean, could it be any simpler? I think not. So that's a fantastic place to end, I think. Now, all I would say is that if you are in a position to support UK Column financially and you're not already doing so, but you would like to, please go to the website and look at ways in which you could either donate or join as a member, because we would very much appreciate that. And of course, it will enable us to sustain the nascent relationship with Germ, which we are, as I say, very, very pleased and excited about. Now, there are thousands of other topics that we could have covered if we had several more days, but unfortunately, that's where we've got to knock it on the head.
I just want to point out, because I know you're not going to, but a number of years ago when I was hosting a radio show, you were my guest, and it's amazing how how we've horseshoed back to where we are here, which is wonderful. So thank you.
Not at all. Thank you. I mean, that would be good for a further discussion. That was specifically about, well, Christianity, but the Church of England in particular, and how it, I would say, abuses its funds. But that is not a topic we can open up now. But no, absolutely, we should come back and discuss that again, because it's an extraordinary topic, and it was it was a great pleasure to talk to you then, and as you say, to come full circle now, what a delight. So we will leave it there. But thank you very much indeed for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Charles.